All right, everybody's ready and got their burritos. We'll have to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chaz English, and I'm president of the University of Kentucky's Federalist Society chapter. On behalf of our chapter, I would like to welcome you to today's debate on capitalism and socialism between Mr. Ken Davis and our very own Professor Brian Frye. A little bit about the Federalist Society. We're a nonpartisan, conservative, libertarian organization dedicated to freedom, federalism, and judicial restraint. The Federalist Society seeks to educate the legal community through its programs and publications about how limited constitutional government based on the rule of law can have a positive effect on law and public policy. Today's first speaker will be Mr. Ken Davis. Mr. Davis's practice focuses on energy, infrastructure, and regulation. In 2013 and 2014, he served as a Deputy Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Virginia, responsible for matters relating to transportation, infrastructure, and land use. Prior to that service, Mr. Davis was a counsel at Hunton and Williams, and before that, a senior finance executive at a Fortune 500 electric power and gas company. Combining the perspectives of an attorney and businessman, he writes and speaks frequently on a variety of topics, including natural rights and constitutional government, American exceptionalism, regulation and regulatory reform, capitalism, property rights, the rule of law, and economic development. Following Mr. Davis will be Professor Brian Frye. Professor Frye is the Spears-Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at UK's College of Law. Professor Frye studies intellectual property and legal history, among other things. He also teaches classes in civil procedure, intellectual property, copyright, and nonprofit organizations, as well as a seminar on law and popular culture. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ken Davis and Professor Brian Frye.
Thanks, Mr. English, for that kind introduction and for the invitation, and thank all of you for your interest in what I think is a very important topic, capitalism versus socialism. Timely. One reason, a recent poll a few months back said that the younger people, the millennials, polled in the United States that 45% or so of them said that they would prefer to live under a democratic socialist form of government and economy and not a democratic capitalist form of government and economy. I find that as absolutely stunning and extremely troubling that there could be this much support for an economic system that over the last 100 years has produced nothing but an unmitigated, unrelenting, unqualified, unbroken series of catastrophes wherever it has been introduced and administered, from Cambodia to China to the Soviet Union and East Europe, and most recently and dramatically in Venezuela. Still, 45% of younger people think they prefer it, and you know who you are. But feeling the burn is one thing, but really carefully considering what is meant in the choice is another. And it's the choice of the two systems that I want to talk about briefly today. Which is better? Now, better is a term of comparison. It requires reference to a standard or some set of criteria. Say I'm looking to buy a new car. Which one of the possibilities is best, and which one of any two of them is better? That depends on my criteria. And those are defined in terms of my purpose, my objective, my needs for the car, the new car. What features do I value? What values of mine will be reflected in the new car that I finally select? It's the same with capitalism and socialism. Two economic and legal systems with greatly different institutional features. Now, Douglas North, the economist, said that institutional features of the economic and legal systems in any country reflect the values of the people who form them. It's not surprising. The institutional features of capitalism and socialism reflect very, very different values. Now, values, in turn, reflect the answers to questions, sometimes fundamental questions. In the case of economic and legal systems, those questions, very important questions, include things like, what is the source, or who is the source of productive, creative economic activity? And what is an individual? And what is meant by society? And how does an individual relate to society? And what is the individual's place in society? And who or what is sovereign? Who or what has ultimate political authority and legal authority in the system? And finally, and in some ways most importantly, where do rights come from? The answer to those questions define the values of the people forming the institutions that will govern them and organize their economy. Capitalism, to function properly, requires an institutionalized legal system characterized by the rule of law. The two work together, reinforcing and supporting each other. Let's consider each of these two institutional sets together. Capitalism. Its basic elements include private property, capital accumulation and wage labor, voluntary exchange, freedom of contract to produce economic cooperation, a market-based price system, and competitive markets. Resources are allocated through those markets driven by voluntary transactions among private parties. Growth is a fundamental feature of capitalism. Growth based on the possibility of mutual benefit from voluntary transactions and trade. Capitalism, regarding the individual, is centered around the concept of the free, independent, economically sovereign individual. The producer, worker, transactor, contractor, inventor, innovator, and so on. Capitalism recognizes that the individual is the source of productive economic activity and invention. Capitalism allocates resources efficiently, but it's more than efficient. Capitalism fosters individual integrity and civic virtue through a positive feedback loop. It rewards cooperation, honest dealing, respect for the rights and needs and opinions of others. It nourishes traditional virtues like courage, justice, temperance, deferred gratification, and prudence better than any other economic system. It tempers raw self-interest and aligns it with the prevailing moral values of society. Now, I'm not suggesting that capitalism is itself a system of morality. It's not. It's an economic system. But it's the economic system most consistent with traditional morality and civic virtue. In fact, it relies on traditional morality and virtuous behavior from responsible people. I'll come back to that in a minute. But first, let's consider the rule of law, the legal institutions that go along with capitalism. Now, the rule of law does not exist in a country just because it has established legal institutions and lots of laws on the books. Many people have studied the concept of the rule of law, and they are in general agreement that the essence of the rule of law, what people talk about when they say it's important to maintain it, is found in the restraint of arbitrary power by fixed, typically prospective rules that are enacted with meaningful consent and openly announced before their prospective uniform application. There's also widespread agreement among people who have looked at the subject that systems of governance that are truly characterized by the rule of law manifest a genuine commitment to individual liberty based on natural rights. Such a system protects the right of property as a natural right. Such a system is also characterized by rules that are accessible and understandable to those that are governed, and a separation of government functions, separation of powers. The rule of law gives individuals control over their resources. It supports commerce because it incents labor, savings, investment, innovation, and sustainable resource management, division of labor, and voluntary exchange and trade. The rule of law, like capitalism, is centered around the free, independent, politically sovereign individual. People are free within broadly defined, open legal spaces to lead their lives. And just like capitalism, the rule of law is a political legal system that most effectively fosters individual integrity, responsibility, and good citizenship. Think of Tocqueville and all his observations. But, just like capitalism, the rule of law is not itself a system of morality. It is consistent with, but also dependent on, and presumes traditional morality and civic virtue. John Adams wrote, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral, self-restrained, and righteous people." So, there are really three systems, and not two. Institutionalized capitalism, institutionalized rule of law, and the values and belief system that supports both set of institutions. You heard me refer to Douglass North and his observation and explanation that institutions reflect the values and interests and the value systems of the people who form them. This is what you'd expect. Now, in any institutionalized system, sovereignty or ultimate authority has to be located somewhere. For most of time, in most places, sovereignty was centered in and located in the consolidated executive of some sort, the ruler, king, queen, warlord, the Communist Party chairman. And in accordance with this sort of belief system, all the institutions supported the ad hoc determinations of the rulers. Now, under such unsettled conditions, because they were unsettled, think of Game of Thrones, for example, economic exchange was rather limited in scope, and it tended to be personal and localized. Now, and this is key, the belief system that defined and drove the West was based on a different concept of sovereignty, the sovereign individual. Christianity, over a period of several centuries, Christianity and then secular classical liberalism combined to bring forth the individual as we know him. For the first time in history, each person was seen as equal in the eyes of their Creator, with the duty to treat his fellows as he would be treated. They were seen as able to reason, exercise judgment and free will, and pick right from wrong. Society came to be seen as an association of dynamic individuals and not a static hierarchy formed around the despotic ruler. These beliefs spawned the development of classical liberal economic and political institutions. As a result of the development of these institutions, based on these values, the countries, principally Western, not necessarily in a sense of location, but in philosophy, Western nations that adopted them enjoyed remarkable progress, economic progress. Douglass North has written about this. The historian Deidre McCloskey has written about this. The results were spectacular. Over 2 or 3 centuries, per capita income increased close to 5,000%. McCloskey calls it the Great Enrichment. And these liberal political and economic philosophies certainly were adopted in the United States, where their expression is anchored in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, something we all take for granted. But if you do nothing, as a result of your attendance here today that you haven't done in a long time. Go read, please, the second paragraph again, or for the first time. Read it slowly and really think about what it means. Blessings, political and economic. The spirit underneath the capitalist system, our constitutional system, and restraint of arbitrary power embodied in the Constitution. Despite the success of those ideas and institutions, as the 20th century dawned, the progressives, Woodrow Wilson as a prominent example, thought the government and country needed to take a different path away from classical English liberalism, more to a model based on the Empire of Germany. Wilson's favorite philosopher was not John Locke, it was Hegel. Entirely different concept of power, government power, that should be, under the German model, centralized in the executive. The old model became the so-called new progressive model. The king becomes the bureaucracy, and rights are again seen as malleable artifacts of government creation. And personal initiative is replaced by the top-down micromanagement of the supposed bureaucratic expert. The results are stagnation that you saw in the last decade before the recent mini revival and improvement. So if you've got a problem with the current, long-term speaking, the current established American economy, your problem is not with capitalism. It's with something that's more akin to the old consolidated executive form of government and better called by corporatism. Capitalism delivered the goods and allowed us to be free. It can again if it is restored. Thank you.
I'm here today to offer a spirited defense of socialism. And the goal of my argument today is to convince you that every person who holds the correct moral philosophy at the end of the day has to be a socialist. Now, that doesn't sound very nice, right? We've got Ken Davis here. He was just defending capitalism. Ken's a nice guy. I know he's a nice guy because I had him on my radio show this morning, and we were talking. I'm not saying Ken's a bad guy. In fact, I'm willing to bet that when I'm done, Ken will agree that he too, at the end of the day, is a socialist. Okay, so before we start, I want to kind of define our terms, because I think that's really important. We're talking about capitalism and socialism. What do we mean? I want to talk really simple terms, right? Capitalism means the market allocates resources. Socialism means the government allocates resources, right? Real basic definitions. Lots of people offer different definitions, but we'll keep it simple for the purpose of today's argument. Okay, so how am I going to defend socialism? Well, I can go the easy route, right? I could be a deontologist. I could say socialism is the best, is the right morals, is the moral system to adopt because it's more fair, right? Because it's more just, because it's the right thing to do. But I'm not going to do that because I don't like taking the easy way out. I'm going to make it hard, right? I'm going to offer you a consequentialist, a utilitarian defense of socialism. I'm going to try to argue to you that you should be a socialist because at the end of the day, socialism will produce the best outcomes. And what kind of best outcomes will it produce? It will produce the outcomes that deliver the most net utility or welfare to everybody. I'm going to prove that to you in a way that I think you won't be able to reject. Okay? So at the end of the day, what we're trying to prove here is that socialism will produce the best consequences. In other words, at the end of the day, socialism will make everybody as best off as they could possibly be. Okay, so how am I going to start? Well, I'm going to start by saying capitalism is awesome. Now that seems like a weird way to start the defense of socialism, doesn't it? Right? Well, don't take it from me. Take it from this guy. You know who that is? That's Karl Marx. You know what? Karl Marx thought capitalism was awesome. Right? Now, everyone knows Karl Marx was the apostle of communism. How can that be? Well, Karl Marx recognized that you can't have communism without capitalism. Right? Karl Marx knew. Karl Marx was no dummy. Right? He saw the way the world works. He recognized that the Industrial Revolution was producing more wealth than had ever been available in human history, and he knew that if you don't have stuff to distribute, you can't distribute it, right? So Karl Marx knew we need capitalism. Why? Because capitalism is super duper efficient, right? Capitalism is the best way we have ever found to generate the most wealth possible. Capitalism makes us rich, and Karl Marx knew unless we're rich, we don't have anything to redistribute, right? We've got to generate the wealth before we can give it to people, right? So Karl Marx's whole theory was premised on the idea that we need capitalism to make us wealthy so that we have the wealth to achieve communism. And why does that matter, right? Because look, we can say capitalism. What does capitalism do? Capitalism maximizes net economic welfare. In other words, by instituting a capitalist system, we ensure that our economy operates as efficiently and effectively as possible to generate wealth, to generate money. In other words, the aggregate amount of wealth generated in a capitalist system is going to be more than in any other system. But there's a problem there, right? Recall, what are we trying to maximize? Utility. We're trying to maximize utility. You might call it happiness, right? And the problem is that wealth and happiness, well, you know, they have a certain correlation with each other, are not the same thing, right? And also note, when we say capitalism maximizes net economic welfare, what we mean is it maximizes the ultimate size of the whole pot when you put everything together. What doesn't it do? It doesn't distribute it, right? In fact, in many cases, capitalism ends up accumulating wealth in the hands of a relatively small number of people. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It might be very efficient, right? It might very well be the case that allowing a small number of people to hold the vast majority of the wealth is the most efficient way of generating the most wealth possible. But you know what? The problem is that our goal is not generating wealth. Our goal is not maximizing wealth. Our goal is making people happy. Capitalism isn't our goal, right? Capitalism is just a means to an end, right? Remember, you've already accepted the premise that what we're trying to do here is maximize utility. Capitalism can help us get there, but it can't do it itself, right? If we want to be utilitarians, if we want to maximize net utility, we have to figure out what's going to make people happiest, and we can know for sure that capitalism can't maximize utility, right? It can make us happier than we are without capitalism, but we can do better. How do we know that, right? Because of the diminishing marginal utility of money, right? When a small number of people have lots and lots of money, each additional dollar makes them less additionally happy. In other words, there are utility consequences to the allocation of wealth. In other words, by giving too much money to a small number of people, or by permitting a circumstance to exist where a small number of people have most of the money, we can't maximize utility, right? We need to distribute those resources in order to maximize the utility, and economics tells us so, right? This is an inefficient allocation because we're not maximizing what we're supposed to be maximizing for. So, by extension, if we are utilitarians, it implies that we must support redistribution of economic welfare. In other words, we must support socialism if we want to get to maximum net utility. Unfortunately, this really breaks my heart here. There's a real problem, right? There's a deep, profound problem. There's some terrible, terrible thing that is stopping us from accomplishing socialism. You know what it is? Democracy. Because democracy sucks, right? There is nothing good about democracy. Why is there nothing good about democracy? Because voters are fucking stupid. Stupid. Some of them are literally stupid, and the rest of them are rationally ignorant. What does that mean? It means voters don't know what the fuck they're voting about, right? They don't know who they're voting for. They don't know what policies are going to be enacted. They don't have any clue what's going to happen if those policies are enacted. So we're relying on people to make decisions for us who are morons, and we know that they're morons, right? That's going to be the big problem if we want to start trying to efficiently allocate wealth in order to maximize happiness. Voters are going to be an issue. And you know what? That's not the only problem with democracy. The other problem with democracy is voters aren't just idiots. They're hateful idiots. Right? Why do people actually vote for things? Well, all of these wonderful motivators cause people to make voting decisions. Do people make voting decisions because they want to maximize utility and redistribute wealth to ensure that everyone's as happy as they can possibly be? No, they vote because they're racist, because they're sexist, because they're nationalists, because they're classist, because they're greedy, because they're jealous, because they're envious of other people, because they're hateful assholes. Right? So what's stopping us from achieving socialism? Democracy is. So what do we have to do? What do we have to do if we want to achieve true socialism and make everyone as happy as they can possibly be? Well, we've got two options. We can either ignore the voters entirely and just enact good policies on our own. Why do we pay attention to these voters in the first place? We know that they're idiots, and we know that they're hateful idiots. Why are we doing this? This is a crazy system. Why are we asking these people what they think we should do? They have no clue, and when they do have a clue, their ideas are terrible. Could not be worse. Everything they want us to do is evil and vicious, right? They care more about hurting other people. They see life as a zero-sum game. We're utilitarians. We think everyone can be better off. This is a terrible, terrible situation, but we have another option. We have another option. We can wait until voters become rational utilitarians, right? We can wait until voters accept that what they need to do is learn what the best policies are, and they can accept that what they need to do is be good utilitarians and maximize utility and redistribute for the benefit of everyone so we can maximize happiness and live in a socialist utopia. Thank you.
We'll now have a 5-minute rebuttal from Mr. Davis, and then a 5-minute rebuttal from Professor Frye.
I'm not convinced. But first, let me say how fortunate I think you are to be students at a school that has a professor like Mr. Frye. A program like this, I mean, I'm lucky enough to go around the country to different schools and law schools and talk about these things. And in a lot of places, and I'm sure you've heard about it, maybe seen it, the spirit of current days is best captured in sort of sit down and shut up. And don't debate, and don't consider in any sort of an open fashion. So you are lucky, and this is good, but I'm not convinced. And here's why. I think and this is why, obviously, it must be such a good instructor and intellectual leader for his classes. He has so well captured the what I would say, not in reference to him, but in general reference, so well captured the hateful, anti-democratic, elitist, dictatorial, proto-totalitarian concept that resides in central economic planning and anti-democratic political control. He is quite right. As the 20th century dawned and the progressives, resident in the newly expanding and ascendant universities, many of which were patterned after German universities, the first set of faculty at Johns Hopkins was entirely educated in Germany, for example. They looked at changing America with its urbanization and immigration from Southern Europe and its exploding cities and labor unrest and tenements and everything, and they were not only not happy, they were afraid of the people. And so anti-democratic notions were soon to the fore. You read Woodrow Wilson's book, essay really, I think, Administrative Government, dismissing the declaration and concepts of individual sovereignty and personal responsibility as outworn relics for perhaps usable in a simple agrarian past, but not now, when things were really complicated and modern and thriving and throbbing, because after all, it was 1902 and things were really new. People just aren't up to it. Needed experts, bureaucratic experts schooled in the social sciences to lead and instruct people like Wilson saw when he looked in the mirror and talked to his colleagues in the university. So you read Wilson's writing, and Edward Bernays was Wilson's World War I propaganda minister, and he wrote a book called Propaganda, and you download the whole thing for free, PDF off the internet, and you will be, I hope, you will be shocked at the poor attitude he had for the average people, and that was just representative. The problem, though, is, all right, the better sort, Wilson said, the better sort, we're going to decide about distribution and regulation and production and everything else because we're experts and we reside in the consolidated administrative state. We're really smart people, and we can nudge the ignorant masses along, like Cass Sunstein says, or just fool them, like Jonathan Gruber said. But what in practice, that doesn't end up in some kind of platonic, disinterested, objective, ideal distribution of resources and organization of economic activity. It ends up where it always ends up, in the fill in the blanks, the Republican Guards, the Central Committee, the Army, the Kim family. Lo and behold, they need the best because they are the best. No, sovereignty, what makes this country exceptional is not its power, it's the restraint of power and the recognition that individual citizens in acting through their elected representatives are the ones best, the only ones who can make decisions about the allocation of resources that are best. Because as Margaret Thatcher reminded us, there is no such thing as a separate thing as society. Society is made up of individuals who are their own best resource allocators and life livers. So I'm not convinced.
I'll keep it brief, so there's some time for questions. I'm sure all of you have comments and thoughts you'd like to share. As is probably obvious, my defense of socialism was at least slightly tongue-in-cheek. But I mean it too. I also mean it from a theoretical standpoint. I absolutely mean it, right? Because even if socialism isn't perfectly efficient, it doesn't have to be, right? Economics tells us that it only has to be more efficient than the alternative at maximizing utility. So we can tolerate an awful lot of inefficiency in the redistribution of resources, so long as our redistribution is more efficient than the inefficiency caused by the diminished marginal utility of wealth in a non-redistributive situation. So there's actually, I think, a lot of room for maximizing efficiency with respect to utility, even if we don't necessarily maximize utility with respect to net wealth. But beyond that, I agree with Mr. Davis that a big problem here is restraint. The problem is, I'm not so sure that democracy is such a great tool for restraint, referring to contemporary events and all that. Color me skeptical, as it were, that democracy is achieving a great deal in the way of good decision-making, good policy-making, and restraint. I think we can do better. I really do. I think we can do better. I think people have a really Pollyanna view of democracy, and they think it achieves and can achieve things it's not capable of actually accomplishing. I think we ought to be circumspect about the kind of things that we ask voters to do when they're clearly not institutionally capable of accomplishing those goals. And honestly, I don't think we even mean it, right? We talk about the United States as if it's a great big democracy and all the decisions are democratically made, but actually most of our governance structure is epistocratic. In other words, it's run by experts, right? Agencies run everything, right? Y'all are in law school, right? What do you think courts are? Courts are epistocratic institutions, not democratic ones. The Supreme Court is an epistocratic institution, not a democratic institution. It's making decisions on the basis of what those 9 learned people think is right, not on the basis of what the population thinks is right, or at least it tries to, right? That's the reason it's there in the first place. In fact, that's the argument for having it, right? I think we intuitively recognize the need for epistocracy, even as we collectively convince ourselves that what we really want is more democracy, which you might otherwise refer to as mob rule.
All right, we've got some time for some questions, so if anybody has any questions, you have a microphone coming around, so go right ahead.
So are your questions for both people or one in particular?
Either one.
So I guess could both of you please comment on how Norway has the highest Gini coefficient as well as the highest Human Development Index?
Norway. Well, I'll say what I think your question is getting at, but correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, yes. All right, the Scandinavian countries are examples of successful socialism. Look, it's clean, prosperous, they all live to be 110, and everything. Fine. Look, we're talking about a continuum here from, in this case, capitalism to communism. You'd really want to look before you assume that any of the Scandinavian countries are socialist success stories. You'd want to look pretty closely at their forms of property ownership and capital markets and financial systems and all the rest of it. They certainly have some features that are sometimes associated with socialism, like national health insurance and stuff like that. But every country also has a bunch of features, including in the Scandinavian countries, geographically small, historically and ethnically homogeneous societies, largely speaking, that make, among other things, programs of redistribution, economic redistribution, work maybe differently than in a country like the United States, which is large, 300 and some million people, 5,000 miles from here to Hawaii and the rest of it. But the real question to ask yourself is, in this country, what are your answers to the fundamental value questions I asked at the beginning? What do you think the place of the individual in society is or should be? Where do you think economic productivity and creativity is located? Where should sovereignty be located, ultimate authority? And like I said, perhaps most importantly, where do you think rights come from? Because if the whole thing is set up to respect and protect pre-existing, unalienable, natural, inherent rights possessed of people at their birth, that leads you in a certain direction for what's a proper activity by the government. If you think the government, if you think rights are created by the government, and I'm not, of course, there are always positive law provisions that must recognize and institutionalize natural rights like property. But if you think property, for example, is only and solely a government creation, then that leads you in a different direction. And which kind of a country do you want to live in, where your rights depend, if you want to live in a country where the rights depend on the next election and the size of the budget?
All right, so thanks. It's a great illustration of my point. Okay, remember, our premise here is we're asking the question, do we make people better off? Do we increase net utility, right, by distributing wealth through the marketplace or distributing wealth through the government? And Norway's a great natural experiment, right? Because Norway just so happened to come into a giant pot of money, right? Norway has giant oil fields off the North Sea, generate huge amounts of resources, and Norway very efficiently and effectively uses those resources to distribute resources to uses that pot of money to distribute resources to its citizens, and it pretty clearly, as you pointed out, makes them much better off, right? So that suggests to me that there's a lot of room to make people happy by redistributing resources. The problem is there's always the problem, right? You gotta have the resources first, right? Not every country's Norway, not every country has a big pot of money that they get to distribute. If you don't have the big pot of money to distribute, you got nothing to give people, right? So the question is, where do you get the resources from to give out to the people in the first place? I wish we could have a whole bunch of Norways, because then socialism would be a piece of cake.
Anybody else?
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess this is more oriented to Professor Frye, but how is it in your argument you make the jump from redistribution to socialism? Because I don't think the former necessarily implies the latter, especially considering that many classical liberals advocate for a negative income tax.
right? Well, you forget that, Barrett, that I define my terms, right? So as long as I define socialism as redistributing resources through the government, I win.
I guess the harder point is saying that net wealth isn't the same as net utility. How do you reconcile that with like Nozick's arguments with like the Volt-Chamberlain thought experiment and anarchy-saving utopia?
Remind me of that one. I'm foggy on the Volt-Chamberlain.
Basically, a bunch of people would get in a room and pay Volt-Chamberlain a bunch of money to play basketball. They're all poor. He's a lot more rich. And it's basically saying that it's not an in-state distribution thing, but kind of a dynamic process where redistribution might actually decrease net utility at the end.
Sure, maybe sometimes. Yeah, I mean, it's always possible that, people derive so much utility from giving up particular resources that it's worth it for them to make the choice. I'm not saying anyone should stop them from making the choice. The only point is that economics literally, economic theory implies to us that the diminishing marginal utility of resources says that giving more and more people to a small number, more and more money to a small number of people ultimately is not going to increase utility as effectively as distributing those resources more widely, because the marginal utility decreases with each one that they have on average, right? Every single time? No, not necessarily, right? Easy to come up with a thought experiment where it doesn't, but in the real world, it's just true.
One additional thought on redistribution. In Norway's case, or in some, I'll say, special case where you've got a pot of money sitting there at the beginning at time zero, and then the question is, all right, let's talk and debate about mechanisms to redistribute that pot of money. Okay. Then a focus on redistribution, leads you to certain conclusions. But what you're really talking about is a system that first has to produce wealth before you have any to redistribute. And Marx, I guess, looked at capitalism, and I think it's accurate to say, he said, all right, they've built up this pot of money, now we're going to smash them and redistribute things and set it all up. But it's not a one-time thing. It's like mistaking a $5 bill for wealth. Wealth is the ability to earn money. And so you've got to say, well, what kind of a system is most likely in a continuous basis to produce stuff that might include surplus as defined by the elected representatives of the people to be distributed? And that is not socialism, because the Venezuela gets in the spot and pickle it has because you start killing.
Excuse me, if you've got a class at 1 o'clock and you need to go, please feel free to go.
You kill the goose, or as Prime Minister Thatcher famously said, the ultimate problem with socialism is that sooner or later they run out of other people's money to spend.
All right, well, thank you for coming today.